As someone who has worked and studied a little bit in fashion and who loves sewing, I'm always really interested in seeing what goes into the fashion moments that we see on the runway or on celebrities. So I'm going to use the little bit of knowledge that I have to give you some insights into how some of the trends we've been seeing recently go from the design studio to the red carpet. Let's talk about slip dresses. There always seems to be someone wearing a slip dress, whether they're in or not, although I feel like I've seen them enough times in the past few months that it's fair to say that they're in right now. Dakota Johnson wore one by Gucci to a party. I believe it was a Bulgari party. Lindsay Lohan wore this elegant gray one, I don't know who it's by, to the Michael Kors show. Slip dresses also showed up on the runway quite a few times, including at the Knowles show in London and this very languid look 22 from the Ralph Lauren show in New York. People who sew will already be familiar with this, but for those who are not, most, not all, but most of these slinky slip dresses that conform beautifully to the body are cut on the bias. To put it very, very simply, instead of cutting the pattern up and down on the fabric, which is called the grain line, you cut it diagonally, which is called the bias grain line. The bias has natural stretch because of the fact that you're cutting a woven fabric right in between the cross threads, which relieves some of the tension of the weave, and that gives a lot of bias cut fabrics a very fluid drape. It can also be a real pain in the butt to sew if you don't know what you're doing, but that's another story. Slip dresses made this way are often more expensive than, say, a comparable A-line dress, for instance, because cutting fabric diagonally requires more fabric. Slip dresses are often made out of silk satin or another silk-based fabric, especially high-end slip dresses, although they can of course be made out of synthetics such as polyester as well. Next up is Fringe. We had Lisa from Blackpink performing at the 2024 VMAs in this look by Chrome Hearts. It has this corset, which is very bedazzled by red fringe. It might be leather fringe, I'm not sure. Fringe also came up on the runway quite a bit during New York Fashion Week, including at Kate and Ralph Lauren. Is it Ralph Lauren or Ralph Lauren? I always pronounce it Ralph Lauren, but I feel like it's actually pronounced Lauren. Anyway, fringe has been used on clothing for apparently thousands of years. However, it has a particular association with Indigenous peoples of North America. So according to a few sources I've read, Native American tribal nations used and continue to use fringe in clothing and footwear for both practical and aesthetic purposes. Now, unfortunately, the sources that I consulted did not specify the names of actual nations. And while it may be that using fringe was a widespread practice across the continent pre-colonization, I have a feeling that individual nations or groups of nations probably had specific techniques or aesthetics that they used in their hidework. Indigenous peoples are not a monolith. Anyway, so apparently among many Native American nations, I wish I could tell you specifically which nations, it was common practice to use fringe as a way of repelling water, but also, and I find this really fascinating, as a way of not having to cut down the seam allowance. For those who don't know about sewing, when you sew a garment, you don't sew right at the edge because that would be unstable. So you have this extra room, usually 1/4 inch or more, away from the raw edge that you have to figure out what to do with. So I think it's really ingenious to cut it into fringe because apparently it repels water. It gives the garment or footwear more flexibility than if you just had like this honking seam allowance just left there. It doesn't waste fabric the way it would if you cut the seam allowance off, and it looks cool. That is just one of many examples of Indigenous ingenuity. In an industrial setting, typically fringe would not just be cut from the raw edge like this, it would often be sewn on after. It can also be embroidered, especially if it's beaded fringe, like on this Dior haute couture gown that Celine Dion wore to perform at the Paris Olympics opening ceremony. It can be made out of a variety of different materials. Of course, cut leather or hides is something that is well known, but it can also be made of beads, twisted yarns, and many, many more fabrics. Next, we're going to talk about sheer fabrics. I don't personally think that sheer fabrics always look that great, and part of that is because of the technical challenges that they pose, which we're going to talk about in a second. But some of the interesting sheer looks or looks with sheer components that have cropped up recently include this look by Chapel Rowan at the VMAs by Y Project. It uses layers of sheer fabric in different shades of beige and brown to give depth to the dress. And Megan Thee Stallion's look, also at the VMAs, which uses subtle sheer tights to kind of connect the whole look together. There have been quite a few sheer looks on the runway in New York and London as well, including Kate, Tory Burch, Off-White, Laquan Smith, Nancy Dojaka, and many more. Sheer fabrics are sheer because they are woven or knit in a much lower density than opaque fabrics. The threads just are not as close together. The threads themselves may also be thinner, although that's probably not always the case. Now, one of the reasons that I don't think sheer fabrics always look that great, in addition to the fact that they're often kind of flimsy looking, is the fact that you can see the seams inside. I think that the seams that typically look the nicest are often a bit more expensive to manufacture, like a French seam where you basically turn one side of the seam allowance over the other side so that it's all encased nicely. Or if it's a custom look, for instance for a red carpet or an haute couture client, you can bind the seam in an opaque fabric that's the same color as the client's skin so that it kind of disappears. I've never personally done this myself, however, I'm pretty sure I saw a Loïc Prigent video. If you don't know Loïc, he is a French fashion videographer, and I think he did a video, it might have been at Chanel, where the haute couture seamstresses actually used this technique, and my mind was blown. Unfortunately, really fancy techniques like that one are not common, and even if you do a French seam, it's not guaranteed that it'll look great, because shears can just be tricky. There are a lot more trends I could talk about, including bold shoulders and sculptural necklines that seem to be everywhere on the runways these days, but maybe I'll save that for another video. Thanks so much for watching. As always, take what I've said with a grain of salt, and I'll see you in the next video.